shape of it. All right, we just finished our spot illustrations. So now we're going to use those spot illustrations from assignment 5 to be the focal point of our posters for assignment 6. And now we're adding to the skills of digital inking, of digital coloring, of making an offset, with the skills of type design. And really, this is no new information. It's just applied in a different way. So we've done vector symbols. We did that in assignment 4, right? So what is type other than vector symbols, like black shaped vectors in the shape of a T or the shape of an A, right? But when you put it all together, it has this secondary read besides just black shapes as a concept, right? Whether it's Texas, whether it's good, whether it's point, whether it's humility. Sometimes the text can be hard to read, and sometimes that's part of the point, right? So the type design will speak to clarity, it will speak to directness, it will speak to kind of the personality of it, whether it's severe, whether it's joyful. And all of that can be informed by the spot illustration you've already started. So some past examples. Not only are we designing typefaces, or we won't design an entire typeface, it's not a typography class. That would be when you design, all the letters, and you design punctuation, and you design the numbers, all in your own style. That's typography. But we are going to be customizing and arranging the letters we need for our project. So whatever text you decide goes with your illustration, you're going to be modifying, at the very least, from existing typefaces to make those the letter forms you want, in the placement you want, and then in the colors and effects that you want to go with it. So this one was informed by kind of tattoo design. And it starts with what's called a type blocking or a text blocking sketch, where you just play with different arrangements of that lettering with your illustration. And then the next thing is the actual poster design, the layout of different elements. So your poster needs 3 minimum components. It needs your spot illustration, it needs your type, and it needs a background, right? And then the 4th thing that's required but can disappear in the design is a border. So all of these have a border. They have some spacing around them, even if it's just a white border, right? But sometimes that border can take on a different personality, and sometimes not, right? Now, when does poster layout get even more complicated? Because arranging type and spot illustration on a background is already kind of a design hierarchy issue that we're going to deal with. But what if you have multiple focal points, right? This has 2 sets of type design with a spot illustration with an active background. And you can do things like breaking the border. You can play with things like color and drop shadow and effects. And you can have things overlap each other. Sometimes the type just fits the personality of the spot illustration perfectly. Like they're a logo with a logo type. So together they're like a combined mark, right? And I think that's true of this past example. And then other times they each have their own personality, right? Everything's separate and they're kind of their own conversations. So you have to decide what's going to be most powerful, what's second most powerful, what's third. So that's the design part. So how does it all begin? We are going to use a mix of vector and raster imaging for this, just like we did for our spot illustration with vector line art. The vectors, we're gonna make our type design into vectors, which makes it infinitely scalable, right? But then we'll color it just like we colored our vector graphic symbols. We'll color it through layer styles in a raster program, just using the smart object. And then we will raster composite at scale at the right resolution of 16 by 20 inches by 350 pixels per inch, our full poster. So it all starts with laying it out. So Kyle Lambert has done the poster design, the key art design, which is kind of the screen-based presentation of posters, but also the print posters for Stranger Things since they began on Netflix. And he did not design the typeface or the title flag, which is this, This is an imitation of it, but something close to it. But he knows he was given that as an asset, right? Just if I was going to design a Wheaties box, I don't get to redesign how Wheaties is shown. I kind of know that. But what he does get to design for each season of Stranger Things is where that title flag goes. And then he has to add additional title flags like season 2, season 3, season 4. And he also has the advantage of getting to design the key art, the spot illustration or the illustration that goes behind it. So he starts with these sketches. He knows that Stranger Things title is going to go somewhere. So sometimes he puts it on a diagonal. Sometimes he puts it straight and underneath. Sometimes he puts it behind. Sometimes he puts it on the very bottom. This is all just about placement. And you can see that his idea for the spot illustration of the characters is pretty much always the same. And unfortunately, when you're working with media properties, most of that is contractual. Like how big a certain actor's head is, all of that is like stipulated in contracts, which is really annoying for marketing. But it means you have a lot of like set parameters you have to design around. So that's why a lot of movie posters look exactly the same. A lot of key art looks exactly the same, because the star's photo has to take up at least 40% of the image by contract. This is what ended up being used. This is for season 2. And you can see how he's trying to match the illustration shapes to the character of the typography, right? The type design. And I use Stranger Things as an example because there's this great site called The Art of the Title, which is all about motion graphics and type design and kind of opening sequences. Because Stranger Things is something from fairly recent pop culture that really showcases the strengths of understanding type, right? So this is a modified typeface. It's an existing typeface. You can go out there and find it with serifs. But what it really plays with is the kerning, the space between the letters, right? And the reason it becomes kind of eerie and uncomfortable is that these letters actually start interfering with each other's spaces. And if I play this whole thing, it might give me copyright things on YouTube. But what I love is they make a point of that. So their whole title sequence is just about arranging the type. And you see how close they get, and how kind of eerie it feels. And so this is a site that goes through the inspirations. They were inspired by these old kind of paperback, horror novels from the 80s. They want this 80s vibe. They're looking at these 80s movies that have that kind of eeriness to them. And it just informed all of their tests. You can see them trying it with different typefaces, and you really need the serifs. You need the kind of spidery points on things. And then they use that to inform just all of their titling, for each episode. It doesn't work as well with what's called a modern typeface. Looks like Back to the Future, looks like Tron, looks like, something that's not nostalgic, right? So a lot of thought goes into how you arrange type. But this is what they ended up with. So let's look at that now with kind of new eyes. How does that work? So this is the typeface, but this is the typeface with just its standard spacing. And spacing between letters is called kerning. So you hear it says kerned to correct, or to connect rather. So usually each typeface, I was taught that they're each in their own glass of water, right? And you put all the glasses of water together, and when you drop the letter into the water, you want it to displace the same amount of water for each letter. So what does that mean? That means that if you have a bigger letter, like an R, that takes up a lot more space, then you're going to have more space around it so that the displaced space kind of evens out with smaller letters like I, where you don't need as much water, right? So this starts playing with that. This is not arranged to be particularly good. This just uses capitals. And capitals, as opposed to lowercase letters, always auto-space each other. It's why comic books are always lettered with all capitals. It's easier to read. Everything has its own kind of kerned space already. Yes, Eden. So auto-space means you're just typing, and you're in like point size 12, and the spacing is just whatever is given with the letter. Because when you do type design, you design the letter form, but you also design the amount of space around it. That's the default. Does that make sense? So the space between the letters is kerning. Just let's look at this. The S, you see how it has more default space between it and the T than the T does with the R. So lowercase letters, it's a little more varied, because lowercase letters really vary in how much space they take up. A G and an H take up way more space than a lowercase I. So often you'll have non-default spacing around them so that the I is always protected. So if you have an L next to an I, they don't bleed together. So that's all of that is kerning. Now what we're doing is we're going to customize these things. We're going to control the spacing between letters, and we're going to control the sizing. So notice how the S is a little bit bigger at the beginning, and how it's kerned to connect with the T, how the T is kerned to connect with the R, how the stems of the R and the A are like butting into each other, right? This is not default spacing. This is customized to make it feel cramped and uncomfortable. Especially, this is my favorite thing, and it's something they do in the title sequence, is the G and the N. The G gets so close to the N that the curve of the G has to straighten out. And that feels really uncomfortable. Now, the other thing that can be used is what's called leading. Leading is the space between the lines of type. So kerning is vertical, leading is horizontal. And that's because when they had the first printing press and you have metallic type set up in rows, you used lead bars to space the lines of type. Yep. So how thick is that lead bar, right? You can see that the leading that they actually use here is a little bit thinner than the example here, because this is kind of reproduced with available typefaces. All right. And then they're not finished there. There are effects to it. And they actually used an effect where they used a flashlight behind a red gel and used that for kind of the weird lighting behind the letters. So it's not as simple as everything's glowing or everything has a drop shadow. But you can imitate it. Right? Yeah.
You mean that did they do this title physically?
Yeah, as they moved the type, they like videoed each typeface with like this, with a red gel behind the type.
So how did they moved it visually, but did they get every picture of the letters?
So they got photo assets or film assets of the letters static with like cut out of black, like a silhouette of black paper. The letter form is cut out, and then they put a red gel behind it, which is just red plastic, right? And then it's called Ruby Lift. It's what's used for screen printing. And then they just took a handheld flashlight, like an old Stephen King story, and like flashed the flashlight across it while they filmed it. So they got kind of motion on each letter. And then digitally they took those film assets and panned across them, right? So that the letters felt like they were moving into place. So this isn't a typography class, but those are kind of the basic concepts of typography. Understanding the spacing, understanding the heights, understanding when you can have the spacing overlap with each other, but still like the T is overhanging the Y. Realize how that word would just not feel as consistent if the T was in its own shape and then next to it starts the Y. And so those are the kinds of things we'll have to pay attention to with our type. One easy way to do this is text blocking, which is you figure out the shape you want the type to have, and then you cut it up to make the type fit, right? Type, especially Latin text, which is what we use, is really, really versatile. You can do a lot to letter forms and still have them be readable. It just depends how funky you want to go. So this is the difference between something feeling kind of